It does become fairly difficult when you have a given schedule to actually meet that schedule at the end of the day. And what we found is that when they do run into delays and when they do run into situations that they can't control, what happens is that it tends to come out of the pilot's rest time. And that over time, our belief is that over time we're going to end up with a fatigued crew. And when we end up with a fatigued crew, we have a much more higher likelihood that there may be an accident.
Every captain and every pilot is expected to be ready to fly. That's the bottom line of every pilot's responsibility, and the companies underline that. If the pilot is not ready to fly, it's his responsibility to tell the company.
Now, if a pilot makes the decision that he is fatigued or she is fatigued, and that to continue the flying would constitute an unreasonable diminution of the safety standard for the operation, then that pilot faces the management of his company. And opinions to the contrary, which have been expressed to this committee today in my hearing notwithstanding, the threat to that pilot is very real and occurs daily. In my own airline experience, I have seen a number of pilots disciplined, threatened, coerced for declaring themselves fatigued in circumstances which occur in regional carrier operations across this nation every day.
The phrase we use is pilot pushing, where pilots are pushed to continue on in the interest of economy, to change crews at this point, or for a pilot to put his hand up and say, look, I'm just simply fatigued. I checked in at 6 o'clock this morning. It's now 2 o'clock in the evening. I've been on duty 14 hours. I'm exhausted. And they say, but, you know, you're in Springfield. We can't get a crew to Springfield. You've got to take the flight. Now, the intimidation factor is clearly there, and I could parade a string of witnesses in here that would shock you. Now, there is no private sector whistleblower protection. The pilots are intimidated. What will happen quite often is a pilot who resists that, and again, I can produce a hard copy of these instances where a pilot has been terminated. And under the Railway Labor Act, we use the provisions of our grievance machinery and defend him, and maybe 8 or 10 months from now, a neutral will award him his job back. But meanwhile, who paid him while he was off 10 months? And I can assure you that's quite a lesson to all the other pilots out there, and they're intimidated by it. No, make no question, they are flatly intimidated by that type of treatment from a carrier. And so when someone says, don't you think you ought to take this flight on, reconsider how tired you are? Yeah, I think I will, and they'll go ahead and take it, but it's not right. And it shouldn't be up to the pilot involved to be his own whistleblower and be subjected to that type of intimidation.
Do you receive complaints from pilots who feel they have been treated unfairly, disciplined, or otherwise by airlines because they reported in or off duty for fatigue or illness?
Yes, we do from time to time receive those kinds of complaints.
Okay, and do you find that any of them have a basis in fact?
We have never been able to find a pattern. What we have done into each and every one of those complaints that we've gotten. We also, as you know, I'm sure, operate the Aviation Safety Reporting System Anonymous Hotline and have an FAA direct to the administrator type of anonymous hotline that we allow people to use.
If pilots come to the Congress and we say that X, Y, or Z other pilot, naming names, naming specifics, has suffered because that pilot called in fatigue at the hands of this specific company, then forevermore that specific pilot has a very serious career liability with the airline industry for the rest of his days, and in that airline operation, that particular pilot is in trouble. Our point is not to specify some specific company or to cause difficulty for some specific carrier. We're trying to make it clear that this is not a problem that's relevant to some specific carrier or a few carriers. This is a problem which is a consequence of the federal regulations themselves. and their inadequacy in terms of setting some reasonable limit.
I mean, I'm really concerned that we got a lot of very tired people flying up there. We're putting more and more burdens on them with crowded skies. The aircraft get more and more complex, and we're now going to convene a working group, and, you know, we might have to go back to NASA. I've been to NASA. I've talked to them about circadian problems and fatigue. They've done a lot of research. They've published a lot of it. They don't have to produce any new reports. It's all out there. We know about it. Set an absolute rigid standard for duty time.
I am familiar with the NASA research, and what, in fact, when we were briefed about 6 or 7 years ago on that research, what startled me and what startled the NASA researchers, one of whom happens to be an NTSB board member right now, was that fatigue wasn't the thing that was most determinative of the mistakes that was made on an individual crew pairing, but what seemed to be even more determinative than fatigue was how well the two pilots knew each other and their habits in flying.
It's very, very sensitive, and I'm sure the committee realizes that what we're talking about here is probably the most sensitive labor management issue that we have between the pilots and the companies. We will participate, of course, in the committee action that Mr. Broderick mentioned today. But if one takes the time to read the NASA studies, which I commend to everyone on the subcommittee, you will find that NASA says the current rules are adequate.
I understand the problems of scheduling. I've had an airline and an air taxi of my own. I know nothing along the scale of the one I work for now, but I know that if this is an imposed regulation, that the airline management is capable of finding ways to deal with it. If you, as a scheduler, don't have a clock on the wall for a crew, there is no clock that says this crew has to stop, then you can let your crew go on until they go around their appointed rounds. If you have a clock that says at 12 hours, that crew must land at the first airport that's suitable for their airplane. If they're not relieved and they come to 12 hours, they have to find an airport and land on it. And then the passengers have to be bussed and the crew has to go to a hotel. Those schedulers will have a clock on the wall that says 12 hours.
The price is very sensitive in our business. Anybody who says that $10 doesn't make a difference makes a huge difference in the regional airline business. And we can't afford to be paying for a regulation that we don't need.
Any travel local in nature, as the regulation says, any time for meals or showering or preparing for the next day, come out of that rest. So that if the van is late to take this flight crew to the rest facility, and if in the morning it's late, that period comes out of the rest for the pilots. I think that responsibility should be on the management of the company to ensure that that van is there and gets those pilots to their rest facility. The requirement should say that there's an amount of time required at the motel. The pilots must be there for 9 hours. They've got to have that much time at the motel. And if at Arcata, California, it takes an hour or more for transportation to and from the airport, then that should be added to the required rest period so that pilots don't have it taken out of their hide.
Sir, in the real world, that's just not how it works.
Well,
in the real world...
In your real world, you know, it seems that if you, as representative of your industry, think you're representing yourself well by cursing at my legislative director and hanging up the telephone, you got another thing coming. The ATA used to have a clown like you named Bolger. They were not well represented. They figured that out. They got rid of him. A hostile attitude, an obstructive attitude, and an impolite attitude are not going to get you anywhere on Capitol Hill. I'll tell you that. Not just with me, but with other members of this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We've covered a wide range of issues today with the NTSB and FAA testimony on flight recorder, drug testing, criminal background investigations, technology for the cockpit, the low-altitude wind shear equipment training requirements, exit row seating issues, advanced qualification program for commuter airlines, aging aircraft structural inspection for for commuter airline aircraft, but the issue that seems to have just vaulted to the top of the agenda is that of adequate rest, duty time for pilots.